Everybody, what's going on? This week I've got on Mitch. Mitch, what's up?
Thanks for bringing me on, Joe. I'm excited to talk to you. For the audience that may not know, we used to work together at Blockware for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. So it's good to catch up and jam with you.
Yeah, 100%. I think like maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the last podcast we recorded, you and me, was the bottom of the 2022 bear market, basically, with
Yeah, it
FTX
was.
blowing up.
Yeah, right when FTX was going down. I think the title for that was like why the collapse of FTX is good for Bitcoin. And in hindsight, it really was, right? Seeing Bitcoin rehypothecators and fraudsters go bust, yeah, it might cause pain in the short term price wise, but it set the price floor. And then since then, it's been up only. So it's definitely good to get the bad actors out of the space.
Yeah, I remember when that happened. I feel like a lot of people, like even seasoned Bitcoiners, were like, Bitcoin is going to be set back years from what just happened with FTX. And now we're, like 60,000, close to 70,000. It's like Bitcoin ripped significantly higher. And like, obviously it didn't set us back too far.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, since I've been in Bitcoin, I've heard that same thing about a bunch of stuff like China mining ban, FTX, the lawsuits against Coinbase and Binance. And then now I guess the current thing is this attack on privacy and self-custody. Oh, this is going to set Bitcoin back. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But so far, that's kind of been a red herring, I guess. I think that's the right analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's jump right into this though, because the reason I brought you on is I wanted to talk about the conservative case for Bitcoin, or maybe it's the book right there. Maybe it's the American case for Bitcoin. Can you kind of give people an overview of what you talked about in the book?
Yeah, yeah. So it's titled The Conservative Case for Bitcoin, subtitle Hard Money and the Restoration of Traditional American Values. In hindsight, I kind of do wish I titled it The American Case for Bitcoin, but it is what it is. I don't harp on that too much. The general thesis of my book is that Bitcoin is more American than the US dollar. And us embracing Bitcoin and being anti-dollar doesn't mean we're anti-American or anti-America by any means at all, right? A lot of the founding fathers were opposed to central banking. Bitcoin, at its core, is aligned with some of the core founding principles of the United States. So decentralization, property rights, freedom of speech, all this stuff. Bitcoin is it's designed, it's very American in that sense, right? And obviously it's global and it benefits people in different countries. And when I say American, I don't mean, the United States of America necessarily, more so the idea, like the ethos behind America. Bitcoin's super aligned with that. So that's overall the thesis of my book. It's targeted towards no coiners, like right wing, patriotic, your typical like MAGA Southern guy, because Bitcoin appeals to that framework quite easily. And Bitcoin appeals to all frameworks, right? A lot of people, they've seen the title and they're like, well, liberals can use Bitcoin too. Absolutely. Anybody can use Bitcoin. It doesn't matter what like background you have. Everyone has a use for neutral money that can't be debased and can't be censored. And so I just chose to focus my efforts on appealing to a worldview that I come from, right? And so that's kind of the overall thesis and reason why I wrote this book. And I'm happy to sort of unpack everything in detail here.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I've heard you say either on podcasts or another number of times, or just recently in general, is, and I can definitely relate to this, like being from Georgia and interacting with people that I know. It's like a lot of people think, the system is broken and it's like red versus blue. And maybe that's not quite the best way to go about it. And I've heard you say it's not red versus blue, it's actually orange versus green. Can you kind of dive into that idea?
Yeah, 100%. So I make this point, I hammer on it in my book that Republicans, like the modern day 2024 Republican Party, is not conservative in any sense. So if you look by who's in the White House and who controls the Congress, red or blue, it doesn't matter. They both spend a crap ton of money that we don't have. They both rack up the national debt. I mean, President Trump was the one that signed the CARES Act in 2020 to spend all that money and enforce the lockdowns and all this stuff, right? So it's not red versus blue, especially when it comes to conservatism and the national debt and being responsible with our spending. It's most definitely green versus orange. One of the most fascinating things for me as I've gotten into Bitcoin is I realized that other Bitcoiners, maybe they're progressive, maybe they come from a different place in the world. It doesn't matter. Like where they're from or how they thought before they got into Bitcoin, the fact that we're aligned on Bitcoin, we pretty much agree on everything else. Yeah, there's disagreements around the fringe and sort of the details of society, but the core like foundational principles of how a society should run and how people should act in the world, like we agree on everything. I was on a Twitter Spaces this morning, and one of the guys on there was, not conservative by any means, but the fact that we're all into Bitcoin, right? We're pushing towards the same mission, and it definitely aligns our incentives and just our worldview.
How would you explain what money is to like your parents or even your grandparents, someone that like grew up, whether probably conservative and isn't like super deep into technology, but they're like genuine, like they're curious about what you're talking about when it comes to Bitcoin. Like, how would you explain what money is to them?
Yeah. And anybody who's been in Bitcoin has gone down this rabbit hole. And I made it the first chapter of my book because I think this is so important to understand Bitcoin. You have to understand what money is. And because the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, I say that's when we went on the fiat standard, not 1971, but that's a conversation for another time. Basically, anybody who's alive today, their whole life has been on the fiat standard. They've been using dollars. And so there's this really common misconception that money comes from government because we use government money. But money is just a free market good that arises naturally, right? We have the coincidence of wants. You make whatever you make. I make whatever I make. If we want to trade, we have to hope that I want what you have and vice versa, right? So money allows us to exchange goods without necessarily like, hey, you want whatever I produce. And it also allows you to store the fruits of your labor across time. If I was an apple farmer, like my apples are going to rot. I can't just save in apples, right? So I have to convert the apples into something else. And I have to hope, somebody wants my apples. So money is a natural phenomenon in any economy. You can even see it within prisons, right? They use cigarettes as money. It arises naturally. Nobody forces the prisoners to use cigarettes. It's just the best good for satisfying that tool that we need, which is money, right? And so money doesn't come from government. It arises naturally. And why did fiat arise naturally, right? So if, hard money is better, money that can't be inflated as fast. So why did fiat take over gold? Well, it's because as we got into sort of the information age and we went through the Industrial Revolution, we're able to trade a lot faster. Gold physically couldn't keep up, right? So fiat, in a sense, was the best money for a long time, but now Bitcoin is the best money. And so you want the best money in any society, right? And the problem with the dollar is it's centrally planned. And this is where I think a framework that really appeals to conservatives is like they understand the dangers of central planning, right, and socialism, and allowing the government to control the means of production and set the price of any good in an industry. And so Federal Reserve, they set the price of money and they set the supply of money, right? So how many dollars there are and how much does it cost to borrow dollars? That's essentially what the Fed funds rate is, and all the borrowing in the economy bleeds off of that. And so when you have central planning at the core of our economy, right? Because money, it touches every aspect of the economy. So when that blood is being centrally planned, it's going to cause capital to get misallocated in all sorts of ways. And every industry is going to be negatively impacted. So if you're anti-central planning and you're pro-free markets, then you definitely need to be anti-fiat and pro-Bitcoin. That's really the only ideologically consistent view.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think that a lot of people, even older people, especially older wealthy people, like they intuitively know to not hold a large portion of their wealth in cold hard cash, right? Like they know they need to go out and buy real estate. They know they need to go out and buy the S&P 500, or they know they need to go out and buy, all of these different companies that they may not like be analyzing the, balance sheet and income statement of these companies, but they know they just need to diversify out of dollars, right? And so it's like they know the money is broken, but there might actually be a better form of money.
Right. And they definitely do that. They save in assets. Typically, the boomers have been really good about that. I think part of this misconception stems from semantics, right? So words are important. Words matter, and the way we use language matters a lot. And when you say, I bought real estate and it went up, or my real estate appreciated, it gained value. No, it didn't. The unit that you're using to measure value, dollars, lost value, right? The price of your real estate went up, but it's not because that hunk of wood and those nails and screws became more valuable to society. No, they actually eroded, right? They were exposed to the elements. They physically decayed. They're depreciating. but the unit of account, the dollar, is getting debased. And so I think it's really important to understand that aspect of it, right? Because when you just chart the S&P 500 index with M2, they go tit for tat for the last 6 decades, and so does real estate. And so, yeah, they've been using these other asset classes as stores of value, and they understand, you have to get out of dollars. So, but why is that, right? It's because the dollar is being debased constantly, and they try to hide the debasement with all sorts of ways, right? They manipulate the CPI by putting lower quality goods into the basket and changing the goods in the basket, or through shrinkflation, right? So instead of you bought 1 ounce of beef, now you're buying 8 ounces, or instead of buying a pound of beef, you're buying 8 ounces, right? So they can export the inflation to other countries too, right? So they do all sorts of tricks and games to sort of hide the dollar being debased. So if you really want to see, how much is the dollar actually losing value, you just have to look at M2, right? If M2 is growing at 7% per year, then you can be confident that the most valuable goods in society are going to become 7% more expensive per year when priced in those dollars.
Yeah, you made some great points about like the S&P 500 and real estate. It's like when you chart those denominated in Bitcoin, like they're actually going down, right? Like if you buy a house, it's actually decaying over time. Like you have to pay property taxes, you have to do all of this, and you can see like you bought the house in 2013 for 1,000 Bitcoin, and today it might be worth 5 Bitcoin. Like it's a pretty bad return on investment when you could have just been being conservative and actually holding Bitcoin. How would you like explain to them like, okay, that like they might buy into that idea, or they may see that like, okay, my S&P 500 portfolio is down 95% in terms of Bitcoin, but how would you explain to them like why Bitcoin is good money in general? Like what makes Bitcoin better than actually holding the S&P 500 or holding real estate or holding gold or dollars itself? Like what's better about Bitcoin specifically?
It stems primarily from the fact that there's no counterparty risk. So there is no throat to choke with Bitcoin, right? We're seeing with crypto, I guess for a comparison, like any crypto that's not Bitcoin, they do have a quote unquote guy, right? ETH has Vitalik, Cardano has Hoskinson's, etc. Like there's someone to go after. There's someone who can change things and put the protocol at risk. And other asset classes have that too, right? If you own equity in a business, the CEO could, it comes out that he beats his wife or he drives drunk or all sorts of things, right? You have a risk in someone else's behavior. Same with the real estate, right? You're kind of cucked to whatever jurisdiction you're in. So if you had real estate in the Bay Area 20 years ago during the change of the millennia, that was pretty good at the time, right? Because it's Silicon Valley, you've got all these entrepreneurs, everybody building there. But nowadays, San Francisco is like overrun by crime, from what I hear, and there's just homeless people everywhere, and the taxes are really high. So yeah, 20 years ago it might have been great, but now it's not, right? Counterparty risk changed the circumstances of your quote unquote investment and where you're storing your wealth. Another point on real estate is we have survivorship bias here in the US, right? So if you're trying to preserve your wealth for generations, thankfully, like in the US, we haven't had any battles on our soil over the last 100 years. So if you bought real estate in Manhattan 100 years ago, yeah, it's maintained its value across time. But you can't really say that for any major city in Europe, right? Like 2 world wars struck the entire continent, right? So your real estate you weren't able to pass that on to your grandchildren's grandchildren. And so Bitcoin doesn't have any of this counterparty risk. So one, it is scarce, and that's mathematically verifiable and nobody can change that. Two, it's portable in a way that, gold, the other sort of scarce non-sovereign commodity is as well, right? But gold's not portable in the same way that Bitcoin is, nor is it nearly as divisible like at scales, right? So you can't really hold $5 worth of gold, but you can hold $5 worth of Bitcoin. On the other end of that spectrum, if you have $5 billion worth of gold, then you're going to need to pay someone else to guard that, right? You're going to need 24/7 armed guards. You're going to need it in a bank vault. That's counterparty risk that can be seized. Where if you have $5 billion worth of Bitcoin, you can still store it in your head as if it was $50 of Bitcoin. So it really boils down to the fact there's no counterparty risk, right? You don't have to trust anybody with Bitcoin. It's just a mathematical program that just continues to operate, right? A way I like to describe it is, 2 plus 2 always equals 4. You don't have to trust anybody. That's not going to change. Bitcoin's the same way. 21 million max supply, blocks every 10 minutes on average. That's never going to change, and you don't have to trust anybody with that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think like within counterparty risk, and you brought up like the scarcity of Bitcoin, but within counterparty risk, you can like kind of add like dilution risk, where it's like there's no risk that we're going to be able to make more than 21 million Bitcoin. And when it comes to like real estate or, Nvidia stock or whatnot, like we can build more houses. We can, create startups that go out and compete with Nvidia. We can go mine more gold. And these assets are kind of leaking to some extent. Like you have to pay property tax on your houses every year. So it's like if there's a small leak, even if it's very small in these asset classes, you want to move out of your wealth out of the assets that are leaking and into Bitcoin, and you better do it before other people realize that they're holding leaking assets too, and they can buy cheap Bitcoin before you buy cheap Bitcoin. So yeah, I think those are pretty great points there. You have one chapter in your book titled "Free Money, Free Markets," or something along those lines. Can you kind of explain like the idea behind that?
Right. So it's kind of what I was touching on earlier, where if you have the money itself being centrally planned, then you can't necessarily say that we have free markets. There's a common sort of trope and gag now that, oh, quote unquote, real socialism has never been tried. Like you'll see like the college liberals say that. And so I kind of flip that on its head and I say real free market capitalism has never been tried because quite frankly, it hasn't, right? At least not within the last 100 years. The most sort of aligned period of free market capitalism was the gold standard, late 1800s, early 1900s, before they created the Fed. And what did we see during that time period? We saw incredible innovation. I mean, that's when the Wright brothers built the plane. We saw mass transit railways built across the United States. We saw like electric, like we could harness electricity, right? We got all the inventions that spawned off of that. So refrigeration, air conditioning, all this stuff came from an era in which the money wasn't being manipulated. And so Bitcoin allows that once again, right? Except now because it's digital, it can keep up with the speed of commerce. And so when you have the Federal Reserve sort of artificially lowering interest rates over time, it's going to create capital misallocation. And I guess we can kind of unpack. So why does the Federal Reserve lower interest rates over time? It's because they have all this debt. The federal government wants to continue to borrow and they need to do so at lower interest rates, right? And so with all this debt, how can you pay back debt, right? Well, one, you could tax and then pay it back that way, but there's just so much debt. And if you tax your society too much, productivity is going to halt, right? So they're kind of beyond the point of, austerity in which they bring in more in taxes than they spend, and then they can pay off the debt with the surplus there. So the only other alternative would be, I guess they could hard default on their debt, not pay it back, but that's not politically palatable because a lot of the debt is owned by Americans, right? It's boomers that have pension funds that hold US treasuries or stuff like that, right? So they're not going to rug pull all the boomers on, their pension fund obligations and their social security, right? So the only alternative is for inflation to be higher than the interest rates, right? So interest rates have gone down over time. And as long as inflation is higher than the interest rates, they can effectively kind of pay back the debt, right? Because what happens when they print more money? Well, eventually it circulates in the economy. Nominal GDP rises and then their tax receipts rise, but it's not because we became more productive in any sense. There's just more units of currency. So in that way, they're able to kind of pay back the debt, but it's with currency that's less valuable. So over time, we've seen these interest rates go down. And so that creates an incentive for people to borrow more money, right? Because the cost of doing so is lower. And so people can borrow money to fund businesses that they necessarily wouldn't be able to fund otherwise, right? And so we've seen these just massive booms and busts that are far bigger than what we would see under a true free market, right? Because generally speaking, if let's pretend we don't have a centrally planned monetary system, the process of businesses going under and imploding and going out of business, that's a good thing, right? That's the free market's natural immune system, right? So if I run a t-shirt shop and it's unprofitable, I'm destroying capital in a sense. It's the market's telling me, hey, we don't value this good or service enough. And so you're punished by a loss, right? The prices serve as a signal in the economy, right? And so when the signals are being distorted, you're not going to be able to tell, hey, what's actually valuable for society. And so with interest rates being artificially lowered over time, you see all sorts of capital misallocation in ways that we can't even really begin to understand. One of the examples I point to in the book, I think is the most digestible, is college, right? And so the federal government will lend money to any midwit who gets, a 1500 on their SAT. I don't know what a good SAT score is, but anybody can go to college and they can borrow the money to do so, right? And it doesn't matter what they plan to study or, what their academic history has been. The question of should they go to college or not is not even considered, right? And so the fact that they can artificially just, create money out of thin air to finance people going to college, then you get all sorts of human misallocation of capital, right? So people train for jobs that we don't need in society, right? Rather than the trades, which we actually do, right? We need more plumbers, we need more engineers, we need more electricians, right? Instead, you've got people going to college to everybody, study English or history and all this stuff that we don't need in society, but it's able to happen because they can just print the money and debt's artificially cheap. So I know that was sort of a long-winded monologue there, and feel free to pull on any one of those threads.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like there is a lot of capital misallocation that occurs like when you don't let free markets work, and that causes a lot of unintended effects, unfortunately. One thing that you've said recently that I really liked was like you brought up the phrase draining the swamp, which I know like the Trump, is a big use that term all the time, and I like definitely support the idea of draining the swamp, but I feel like like he may not have lived up quite to his expectations on what he was trying to do there. Can you kind of explain like what your idea of draining the swamp would be and like how we would actually go about doing that?
Yeah. So in order to drain the swamp, you have to bankrupt the swamp, right? So when we think about, who's actually sort of at the federal level imposing, like infringing on people's rights, it's not necessarily they're passing bills through the House and the Senate and they get signed by the president and everybody hates it. It's these three-letter agencies that are under the executive branch, right? So it's the FDA, the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, all of these institutions that they don't necessarily represent the people, right? We don't elect the people to serve in these branches of government. And so that's really the swamp. And how are they able to finance all of that? Well, it's because they have access to a money printer, right? Any spending they want to do, they can do it because they can just print the money and they don't have to ask the citizens if this is something they want to fund, right? I'm not like necessarily anti-taxation entirely, right? I'm a conservative. I'm not a libertarian, and I live in the real world. I understand that a state is going to exist in some capacity. I think that capacity should be small, but it will exist. And so there's going to be taxes, and that's just kind of the nature of the beast. But if the government can only finance things through taxation, then they're going to have to be very limited in sort of the endeavors that they can spend it on. And they're also going to have to generate actual political support in order to incentivize people to pay their taxes, right? But they have a money printer, so they can bypass all of that, right? So if you want to limit government's influence, then you have to start by sort of unplugging their just all powerful like Thanos wrist thing that they've got, which is called a money printer. And so you can say drain the swamp, but as long as they have the ability to print money, then that's never going to happen.
Yeah, and to me it's almost like with the dollar debt-based monetary system where it seems like 2008 like it inevitably like wants to contract, but you got to keep inflating the bubble over and over again, whether that was like 2008 or 2020. The inevitable solution is always print more money and big government gets even bigger. And like it seems like that's inevitable until we switch the money. Like if we keep using the dollar, it doesn't matter if anybody is in power. The end game with a dollar based or debt based dollar monetary system is like big government must get bigger forever because that's the whole way the system even functions. Do you agree with that? How do you think about that?
I absolutely do agree with that. And this is your point reminded me of an idea that I heard from John Haar at Swan. I think this is a really key point, especially when someone who's maybe not into Bitcoin hears this, and sort of the boomers that have bought stocks and real estate and they've done well. What would happen if after 2008 the Federal Reserve doesn't step in and bail all the banks out? What would happen in 2020 in COVID when everybody stops working, the stock market crashes, if the Fed doesn't step in and print money? Everything's going down, right? The stock market had its best year of all time in 2020, but that would not have been the case if the Fed didn't step in. So when you're buying equities, when you're buying real estate, there's a tacit implication there that you're betting on money printing, right? Because if the Fed doesn't step in and print money, we're going to see this massive deflation spiral. We're going to see all of that capital misallocation unwind. So when you buy those things, you're betting that there's going to be more money printing, even if you don't consciously think that. And so, what asset goes up the most when they do print more money? It's the thing that you can't make more of. It's Bitcoin, right? So, if you're going to bet on more monetary expansion, you may as well pick the fastest horse in that race, the most poor sponge for that liquidity, and that's Bitcoin.
Yeah, 100%. And you can even take it a step further and recognize that the dollar is designed to debase not just against like real estate or other high quality assets. It's designed to debase against the most basic consumer goods that, can get manufactured incredibly cheaply and more efficient year after year after year. So it's like if the dollar is going to go down against, corn, well, it's definitely going to go down against real estate, and it's also probably going to go down a lot against Bitcoin. So yeah, it's like you're just picking semi-scarce things. You might as well pick, the most scarce monetary tool to ever exist.
100%.
You touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but you kind of brought the idea that Bitcoin kind of has like this American ethos behind it, and like how maybe the founding fathers would have been people that rallied around Bitcoin, or at least like the idea of Bitcoin. Can you kind of expand your thoughts there?
Absolutely. So there's a few different domains in which this is true. I'll start with the first one, which is decentralization. And I refer to the United States of America as like the first experiment in decentralization. And before I got into Bitcoin, that's not something I had even really thought of. But think about from the establishment, we had 13 states at the beginning. Now we have 50, right? That's power is being decentralized across 50 different states. And moreover, you have 3 different branches of government. But I think where the decentralization is really intact is among the 50 states. So and we saw this play out in 2020, certain states were way too restrictive with COVID policy. And we saw a flight from California and New York City to Texas, to Tennessee, to Florida, to Georgia, to the South in general, right? States that were open, like, hey, come here, like, we want you, right? That's the power of decentralization right there. And so Bitcoin is built on the same sort of framework, right? You don't want a centralized power that can control everything. You want power equally, like not necessarily equally distributed, but distributed in some sense, right? And so node operators are essentially like states. They can set their own law and their own rule set. And so Bitcoin is aligned with American principles in that regard. And the second way it's aligned is with property rights. So America was founded on the concept of life, liberty, and property. And when you hold the dollar, it doesn't matter in what capacity you hold it, you don't have inalienable property rights. And inalienable is the key word there, right? Your right to own property, it comes from God. It comes because you're a human, you have a soul, you're created, you exist on this earth. It doesn't come from the Constitution, doesn't come from government. And the dollar doesn't give you inalienable property rights. One is the sort of dilution risk that we mentioned earlier. So you can have cash under your mattress and it's like, hey, this is in my hand, but they can print a gajillion dollar bills just like it, and suddenly yours are worth nothing, right? Or if you have cash in a bank account, well, they can just freeze your bank account. They've done that to people. If you're any kind of political dissident, that could happen to you, right? So inalienable property rights, Bitcoin is a manifestation of that, unlike any other asset. One, the mere fact that it's digital means it can't be physically taken from you. And then among all digital assets, Bitcoin is the most secure, right? The networks, it can't be hacked. There's a physical cost to attack the network, right? There's physical power defending it, and you can keep the words in your head, right? So Bitcoin gives you inalienable property rights, and it also gives you inalienable freedom of speech. And the ordinals thing is like a crazy hot topic of late, and I don't necessarily know where I stand. I'm sort of agnostic on it, but it goes to show, there's a sect of Bitcoiners that are radically opposed to this, but they can't stop it, right? And that's the whole point of freedom of speech. You could be radically opposed to something, but it's still, someone has the right to say it, right? And so Bitcoin allows you to inscribe any text you want to the blockchain. You could say the most vile, horrendous things, and nobody can stop you. I mean, I can imagine, if you live in a really totalitarian state, maybe you live in China or North Korea or whatever, and you want to be able to communicate, you can use Bitcoin to edge your words into the internet forever, and nobody can stop you. And so decentralization, property rights, and freedom of speech, I think those are the areas where Bitcoin's really aligned with the founding principles of America.
Yeah, I completely agree there. How about the idea of personal responsibility? Does Bitcoin bring personal responsibility back, or are we like striving, like a society kind of gone away from personal responsibility to some extent, and Bitcoin might bring it back?
I definitely would say so. And you can view it on sort of the individual level and then also the institutional level. Let's start at the institutional level, right? Bitcoin forces institutions to be financially responsible, right? There's no bailouts, like there's no moral hazard with Bitcoin. If you lose your Bitcoin, there's no safety net to print more Bitcoin to make your clientele whole, right? The case in point, FTX, like we were mentioning earlier, they had a big Bitcoin hole on their balance sheet. Nobody can print more to bail them out. So any institution that manages Bitcoin, I mean, you work at Unchained. I'm sure you guys are very diligent in how you manage your keys. Like very, very, like I imagine, like tight, tight necked about it or whatever. Like there's no messing around, right? Because nobody can get the Bitcoin back. And so the fiat monetary system just doesn't have those same incentives for financial responsibility. If you're a bank and you have customer deposits, you're actually incentivized to be as reckless with them as possible because you want to make returns on these assets that are in your possession. And you know, if you fail, right, if you put all of your customer deposits into long duration treasury bonds when interest rates are zero, and then the Fed hikes rates and all your bonds are underwater, well, it's okay because the Federal Reserve will create a program to make you whole, right? There's all sorts of things like you have to invest your deposits and seek a return, but it's okay because even if you're, you got to be risky to get the best return possible. But if the risk goes sour, the Federal Reserve can print money to make you whole. So it definitely, fiat incentivizes institutional irresponsibility and Bitcoin incentivizes responsibility. And then if you view things on the individual level, right? I think the best framework for understanding this is private keys. So is it hard to write down 12 words and keep them safe? No, it's not hard. It's very simple, but it takes a lot of responsibility. Never before could you have your entire life savings. I mean, unless you wanted to like dig a hole in your backyard and put a bunch of gold in there or something like that, that would be, I guess, personal responsibility for your wealth. But Bitcoin really, it provides that, right? There's no bank that's custodying your assets for you. It's all on you. And that can be a daunting task, but Bitcoin forces you to become more responsible in that way. And also in terms of like, you're managing your own wealth, right? A common thing with the fiat system is financial advisors and wealth managers, and not a knock on those professions, but it's a testament to the failures of the fiat system that just preserving the wealth that you've already earned is a full-time job in and of itself, right? So if you want to spend your free time after your 9 to 5 job studying markets and figuring out where to allocate capital and constantly rebalancing a portfolio, you could do that, but most people don't want to do that. And I don't blame them, right? This stuff is kind of boring to a lot of people. So you have to be, in a way, not responsible for your wealth. You have to outsource the responsibility of wealth management to other people, where I can just buy and hold Bitcoin, right? I'm responsible for custodying it, but I don't have to like sit here and manage a portfolio 24/7. The idea and the thesis is simple, right? It's buy Bitcoin and hold. I don't have to sit here and trade all the time. And so in all those ways, Bitcoin really incentivizes responsibility, which is a conservative value, right? There's this common caricaturism of conservatives, like, oh, they don't care about anybody. They're just like, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We don't care about no one type of thing. And I mean, that's like cliche or whatever, but it's good advice, right? Don't rely on other people. Don't rely on the state. Definitely don't rely on the state for your retirement and how you're going to store the fruits of your labor. And so Bitcoin, it makes people be more responsible, point blank.
Yeah, and it seems like if you don't have a society that encourages that or forces people to like become more responsible, then you end up with like all of these safety nets, and we just end up living in like a nerfed world where people like aren't growing and society is not growing and people become like weak, and it's not a great world to really be living in. It's kind of bad for everyone if we all become weak. Like the meme is like strong men, weak men, whatever, that cycle. Like that feels like kind of what's happening if we don't decide to adopt a money that encourages people to take responsibility.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And Bitcoin personally, I can speak for my own life. It's made me more responsible across all sorts of different domains. I take better care of my health and my mind and my spirit. And I actually, like, before I got into Bitcoin, I didn't even save money. Like I would just like spend what I got at my job. I didn't even care. Like it was just very high time preference behavior. And Bitcoin really kind of turned the ship around for me personally. And I think it can do that for society as a whole, because society is just made up of individuals, right? Even the institutions that we talk about, it's just groups of people. And so Bitcoin rewiring the incentives towards responsibility, I think is going to make stronger people.
Yeah. Another point that I kind of want to make is like the idea that we're like talking about Bitcoin adoption, right? And like we're saying like this is going to be good for society as people adopt it, but it's also like Bitcoin is just a new reality. It's like if you decide to not use Bitcoin, you're going to be economically outcompeted by the people that do use Bitcoin. So like we're saying like Bitcoin is a net good for the world, but it's also like if you as an individual decide not to adopt Bitcoin, then you're probably just going to underperform those that do adopt and decide to hold Bitcoin. Like that's just kind of what we've seen over the last 15 years, and there's no reason to maybe think that it will change over the next 15 years. It's probably going to be the same thing.
Yeah, that's spot on. And you can sort of see, each subsequent generation has it harder economically and financially speaking, right? The millennials had it harder than Gen X, and now the Zoomers have it harder than the millennials because the prices of everything are rising, right? Simple example, if I wanted to buy my first home, all the boomers that are sitting on real estate, and I don't mean that in like a derogatory term, like they're just trying to preserve their wealth like everyone else. When the Fed prints money and the prices of houses go up, their paper net worth increases. But if I'm over here saving in dollars trying to make my first down payment, well, the down payment just got more out of reach, right? And so unless I got a raise that was equivalent to that gap, then it's becoming harder, right? And so the longer you stay on a fiat standard personally, the harder things are going to get for you over time because your labor is just getting devalued. That's really the core of it.
Yep. Another thing that I've been thinking about kind of related to like nuclear family, affordable housing and like raising kids, like kind of this was part of one of your chapters in the book is like I've seen like over time like the birth rate is declining in like developed nations like the US in particular. And like one of my friends worked on Wall Street for years and like now he has a great job like down here in Atlanta, and it's like he can't really like easily afford like a decent house. And I'm like, if you can't afford a decent house, like you're literally in like the top 5%, top 1% of like my age group, like then none of us can really afford a decent house. And like if that's the case, then like this is going to be like a bad period for the world if everyone below the age of like 30 can not really afford a house, and especially cannot afford like kids. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so we've definitely seen over the last few decades birth rates declining, and then the age at which people have their first children on the rise, and then the amount of single parent homes is also on the rise. So the nuclear family is the core of society. If you don't have that, everything starts to fall apart, right? You need a mother and a father in every home to raise the children. Otherwise, they're going to be raised by the world, and they're just going to like the statistics back this up, right? Like if you don't have a dad in your house, you're more likely to become a criminal. You're less likely to graduate high school or college or get any kind of successful job and be a contributing member to society. So you need the nuclear family, point blank. And a lot of people point to various different cultural reasons as to why we've seen this breakdown in the nuclear family. And some of those are valid, but I think the most not talked about reason for it, especially among like the target audience of my book, which is conservatives, is fiat money. Like the devaluation of the currency is making it more difficult for someone to provide for their family on one income. My grandfather, he just had a normal average job at like his local widget factory, and he provided for 4 children, had a house, 2 cars. Grandmother didn't work, raised the children, right? Average job, regular everyday Joe. And now, like if you wanted to provide for a family on one income, like you have to be an absolute dog. You got to go out, really increase your skill sets, like get the best paying job and really contribute a lot of value to society. Like your average, just like guy that works at the post office or, guy flipping burgers. Now I think, as men, we should aspire to more than that. But realistically, like that person should be able to provide for their family. Right. And I don't like to focus too much on, the should of how things ought to be in a world, but you have to discuss the normative economics sometimes, and it's no longer possible to provide for a family on an average income. And by definition, most people are going to be average. And so if you want to restore the nuclear family to like its prominent role in society, then you need sound money, right? And thankfully, like you and I, we have a plan, right? We have Bitcoin. We're going to be just fine. We're going to be able to provide for our families. But the people our age that are still on a fiat standard, they're going to have a much tougher time doing that. I cite a statistic in my book. It was a poll that the Washington Post ran, and of childless people from 18 to 35, I think 1/3 of them cite finances as the reason why they don't yet have kids. And that number is going to just continue to grow over time. And so you have to fix the money in order to really restore the nuclear family.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Another topic that I know you have thoughts on is power projection and like Jason Lowery's thesis. Can you kind of explain what your thinking is there or how you simplify it?
Yeah, so this may be a little long winded, so feel free to stop me at any point if you want me to elaborate on an idea. And the core sort of thesis of power projection is that any property has to be defended by power, right? So property rights only exist to the extent that you can defend someone else from infringing on them. And the first example we can look at is nature, right? So if a lion eats a gazelle, there's no, like, you can't pass a law to stop that, right? The lion simply can project more physical power onto the gazelle. And it sounds like a sad story for the gazelle, but if it was the other way around, the gazelle would project power to eat the lion, right? So it's just the nature of how things are. The second example would be like when the European settlers came to the Native Americans, right? You know, they had guns, right? They could project more power. They took the Native Americans' land, and it's not, the Native Americans were savages in their own right, constantly fighting and battling for property. But the Europeans were able to project more power because they had guns. They had a more efficient way of projecting power. Even when you look at laws, right? So like literal laws in society, what happens if you break a law? Well, men with guns, power, come and arrest you, right? So even sort of the abstract laws in society are simply backed by physical power. So all property has to be defended by power. And Bitcoin has that in cyberspace in a way that's nonviolent, right? So if you want to try to have 51% of the hash power and rewrite the blockchain and double spend coins, then there's still a physical power barrier, right? You need to source a ton of energy and you're just going to be, it's waste, right? It's burn. And there's that physical power that's defending the Bitcoin network. It's defending your property rights. It's defending your freedom of speech. And so that's why I thought Major Lowry's thesis would be a great chapter to include, because even something like the Constitution, like I love it, I respect it, obviously. I mean, it's on the freaking cover of my book. It looks like the Constitution, but it's just a piece of paper, right? There's no physical power there to stop your rights from being infringed upon. And Bitcoin grants you that in a way that like no other asset class really does.
Yeah, his thesis kind of made me realize like we don't even really know what Bitcoin is. Like we think Bitcoin is money, which I think that's a good way to characterize it for now, and it's probably going to be extremely valuable in the future, but it's going like our perception of it is going to like change and evolve over time, and it's probably just going to be like this beast of an asset slash system slash network that we can't even comprehend today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've got the white paper here, and it looks like you got it behind you as well. I like the way yours is, the sort of rustic look. But I was reading this the other day, and it sounds nothing like the Bitcoin that I see today. I mean, Satoshi wrote this in 2009, and I'm reading through, and like, yeah, it's functionally pretty similar, but sort of he really harps on the peer-to-peer transaction medium of exchange aspect of it. But for me, Bitcoin primarily store value. Now, it is a great medium of exchange because I can send it to someone without any third-party intermediaries, and I can get instant settlement if I use Lightning. I can get near instant, like 10-minute settlement if I use the base chain, right? And there's no third party. So it works great as a medium of exchange, depending on the context, but I primarily use it as a store of value. And that's not really mentioned anywhere in the white paper. So yeah, I think our perception of Bitcoin is just going to continue to change. And it already, it means different things to different people. And that's only going to become more of the case as more people adopt it. So you're going to get all sorts of sort of diverse perspectives on Bitcoin. And I don't think that's a bad thing because the core protocol itself is not going to change.
100%. Last kind of like one of the last major questions on this idea of power projection. How about mining and energy? Like, is the Bitcoin mining industry, like, does that tie deeply into the energy industry?
It absolutely does. And you and I both, you used to work in Bitcoin mining. I still do work in Bitcoin mining. So we understand this concept very well. And I thought it was a good idea to include in my book because conservatives are pro energy, right? They're pro oil and gas. They're not sort of, they don't fall into like the ESG FUD and propaganda that is out there. And this idea that energy production is bad. It's so nonsensical, right? Energy production is literally life. Like life is energy. We need to produce as much energy as possible. And so I included this chapter because I think there's a it's ripe for a coalition between conservatives and Bitcoiners and Bitcoin miners to sort of team up on the energy idea. And so how is Bitcoin mining just so beneficial for energy grids? Well, I couldn't think of two industries that are more perfectly compatible, because if you're an energy producer, you face a conundrum. And what's that conundrum? You don't know how much energy is going to be demanded at any given time, right? Energy demand is very volatile. Right now, I'm using this laptop. I've got some lights on. I've got my fans running. It's hot outside. I could have my AC on. But at night, like, everything's going to be off, right? I'm not using power. So energy demand is very volatile. And you want to be able to supply for the absolute peak demand throughout the year. So it's going to be really hot summer days around 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. Everybody comes home, they're cooking, they're cleaning, they're running their AC, etc. But you don't want to be just producing that much energy all the time, because it's not going to be getting consumed, right? You can't, there's nothing to do with it. So you're quite literally wasting energy, and you're losing money if you're the energy producer. So there's this problem, how do you meet energy peak demand, but not be wasting so much? And so Bitcoin miners can step in and buy all the surplus energy, but also turn off at peak demand, right? So yeah, Bitcoin miners are just like on this never ending quest for the lowest cost power. So they'll go wherever the energy is being produced. It doesn't matter where. And they'll buy all this excess energy that nobody else is buying. There's this crazy like FUD out there that, hey, when Bitcoiners are mining, it's like, oh, they're stealing energy from the people, and nobody can run their AC, and they're all like sweating to death and all this stuff. It's like, no, the energy they're consuming wasn't being consumed elsewhere, right? Boil it down to the first law of thermodynamics, right? Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only change forms, right? And so Bitcoin miners are just consuming energy that otherwise would have gone to waste, but they can turn off at any sort of moment to give power back to the grid. And so it's really the perfect fit that solves this demand problem that energy producers face.
Yeah, 100%. So say I'm an older Southern conservative person, and I've listened to this podcast, heard you talk. I've got 1 million. My net worth is like 1 million, 10 million, maybe something like crazy, like 100 million or something like that. I'm buying into some of these ideas, but I'm not like completely sold quite yet. Like what's something that you're gonna say that's gonna like maybe push me over the tipping point, or like one final like key insight that you may have already said, that you may not have said, either way, but like, why should I stop? Why should I consider shifting a small portion of my portfolio over to Bitcoin rather than SP 500, real estate, or whatever else?
Yeah. So chances are the person you've described is on board with the idea of diversification across their investments, right? And so Bitcoin, it fits into that like a glove, right? I'm not saying, you need to be radical and go 100% into Bitcoin, but a small allocation at this point. Bitcoin has solidified itself as an asset class that's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. You can't say the same thing about any of the other cryptos, but Bitcoin, it's been around for 15 years. It has the highest market cap. It has the highest realized cap. It has the highest hash rate. It's the only one being accepted by Wall Street institutions, right? You think Larry Fink would stick his neck out for Bitcoin if he thought this was going to get shut down tomorrow? No. And so if you want to be able to not lose your wealth due to inflation, right? Because the end game of all, quite frankly, like boomer social security payments is money printing, right? That's the only way. It's just a demographic problem, right? That's the largest generation in American society, right? There's more people that are about to withdraw social security than people to pay into it. And so to pay out people, they have to print money. They have to debase the currency. So yeah, like you might be getting your social security check, but in real terms, in actually like what you can purchase, goods and services, it's going to go down over time. And so having a Bitcoin allocation in your portfolio can sort of offset the loss you're going to see in terms of your purchasing power from the rest of your portfolio. So like the right allocation percentage is going to vary from person to person, age, risk tolerance, however much wealth you already have. And so the wrong answer is 0%. That's the only wrong answer.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think another point that came to mind is like the idea of like what's a crowded trade right now. Like I feel like everyone that I've talked to is like, oh, you save by buying real estate, or you save by buying the S&P 500, and you do that passively, and that's what everyone has done for the last 50 years, and that's probably what everyone's going to keep doing for the next 50 years. And it's like you talk to the average person, but that's the case, but the average person is not saying like, hey, you should buy Bitcoin. Like that's a very contrarian trade. And I think the average person also couldn't articulate like why that's a bad idea. Like everyone, like a lot of people like think it may be a bad idea, but I think we kind of just laid out the case that it's a good idea to have some allocation to Bitcoin. And it's also like, something that not everyone's doing or so few people are doing, which means there's probably a lot of upside in just saving Bitcoin.
Right, right. I think once the sentiment towards Bitcoin is no longer hostile in the way that it is, then the asymmetric upside opportunity is going to be gone. So definitely, we're definitely early, as you could tell by that Ohio State graduation clip that was viral yesterday, where they're all groaning at the sound of Bitcoin. And I guess one more point I would like to add before we sort of wrap things up is Bitcoin never has to become a globally recognized medium of exchange for it to succeed as a store of value. I've always viewed a medium of exchange as sort of cherries on top of the sundae, right? Just because I can't spend my Bitcoin at Whole Foods doesn't mean, the 21 million scarcity is not in play, right? Like the 21 million thing is still there. People are still going to buy Bitcoin as a store of value. And so numbers are going to continue to go up, even if we don't see mass adoption in terms of people using Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis for payments. And so that's just something that's important to keep in mind because, I mean, quite frankly, like the ETF, that's not a medium of exchange. You can't send shares of the ETF, but that's where a lot of the capital is going, especially, over the next few years. So Bitcoin is definitely going to work as a store of value. I'm not concerned about that in the slightest. I would love for it to be a medium of exchange, but either way, numbers going to go up and you should have some in your portfolio.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's like Bitcoin doesn't have to change at all for it to keep going up in price very significantly over the next 20 years. Like it just has to not break. And there's absolutely no reason to suspect that it will break. You can even argue that it's probably a lot more, sturdy or robust or even anti-fragile than like a lot of the existing systems that we have today that store our wealth. So yeah, I think those are some great points. Any final thoughts or any, obviously we talked about your book a lot. Where can the audience, go find it? What's the title again? Where do they go?
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on for this conversation, Joe. You can find it on Amazon, The Conservative Case for Bitcoin. It's priced at $17.76. So you'll find it on there. And you can follow me on Twitter at Mitchell Hodl, and you'll see it in my pinned tweet. So I really appreciate it, Joe. And yeah, if anybody, yeah, like my DMs are open all the time. I'm happy to talk about this stuff. So if anything I said here interests you, definitely shoot me a DM. We can talk Bitcoin.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I'm glad that we could get on this and talk about it. I've showed a few people the book, and every time one of the few things that they see is the 1776 price, and they're like, this is a good book.
Yeah, that was a great marketing thing. I thought of that like 2 nights before. I was just laying in bed, like, I don't know, how much should I price this thing? And I'm looking, I'm like, oh, this is perfect because it was right under the Bitcoin standard, and then it's a meme. So it was great. And anecdotally too, like this book works for no coiners. I've had one of my good buddies from college, like he had no Bitcoin exposure. He read this. Now he's got a 10% allocation. And then my friend, her grandmother saw it sitting on the table, never like thought about Bitcoin at all. She just picked it up because I guess she was bored or whatever. And she gets halfway through the book in one sitting, and I'm over there and I'm starting to. She's like asking me all these questions that are very like she's starting to do the homework, and like I could see the gears turning. No Bitcoin experience at all before, so it definitely works for orange pilling no coiners, and that was very much my goal with this book. So, and even my dad, I've been trying to orange pill him for like 3 years. I was talking to him on the phone last night, and he was explaining to me. Well, he was just like hitting on the point, like, yeah, all these other cryptos, they're not Bitcoin. Like, I get it now, and I think it's because he got to that chapter in the book. So this works if you got conservative people in your life that you want to orange pill. I think this is the best resource for that.
Yeah, it's a great gift if you're like on the fence about Bitcoin, and it's also a great gift if you like Bitcoin. You might want to share the book with people that you know. So yeah, it's also like very affordable. I feel like on Amazon now, every decent book is like $25, $30, $50 or now. So it's a good price. But Mitch, this was awesome. Thanks again for taking the time to do this.
Yeah, appreciate it, Joe.
Sweet.